Hey everyone, and welcome to WDIM News, my weekly podcast where I talk about sci-fi stuff and some other stuff. My name is Eric. Thank you very much for joining me. Well, we are on the precipice of the finale of Star Trek Picard, so I've decided to devote this entire podcast to the series in preparation for this event. I will first review the 9th entry of the series, titled Vox, and give you my opinions on one of the most talked about episodes of Star Trek ever made. If you watch my breakdown of said episode, I mentioned that I would answer questions taken from the comments, and I found a few that I want to touch on here. After that, I'm going to throw out a few predictions for the finale and where I see these characters going after that. Then finally, I want to ask a question about the current and future state of Star Trek and why my opinion on it is not always the most popular one. So first, let's talk about the 9th episode of the final season of Star Trek Picard, titled Vox. As always, there will be spoilers in my review, so if you have not watched the episode yet, you might actually not want to watch this whole podcast. You might just want to watch that episode first, because I'm going to be talking about the whole series for this entire podcast. So first, let's talk about things I liked, and then I'll talk about things I don't like. Okay, so first, the thing that I like the most is the thing that probably everybody liked the most, was the reveal of the Enterprise D. It was leaked, I think, by Captain Picard himself, Sir Patrick Stewart, at one of the conventions. He stated that he was back on the bridge of the Enterprise D and that he liked the carpet. So it's kind of funny that he made that comment in the series itself when he actually made that comment on stage as well over a year ago. I thought it was very fitting that Riker stated something about, like, is it smaller? Am I bigger? I think that in the movie Star Trek Generations, they adjusted the bridge because the filming, something with the filming aspect ratio wasn't correct. It's different on the movies than it was at TV at that time. They had to beef it up, basically. The bridge that we saw is actually the old bridge, and I think that's why he said that it looks smaller. It's obviously where this series, and definitely where this season has been going towards, is getting all these characters together and then getting them back on the bridge. I mean, it's basically just a full circle back to Encounter at Farpoint, without obviously a couple characters. And, this wasn't kind of guaranteed. I thought maybe this would have been a flashback. We got a couple flashbacks at the beginning of the season, so I thought, well, for sure, we'll probably get a flashback to the old Enterprise D and get, some de-aging technology on the actors and stuff. But it was cool. I like the way they did this. I like that, we got to see the Enterprise D again. It was kind of teased a few episodes ago when they arrived at the Fleet Museum and the LaForges were talking about what's in Hangar 12. And we finally, got to see it. So it was cool that was a payoff. And I think it paid off really well. Another thing I really liked was seeing Shelby back. I mean, now she's an admiral. She was obviously a part of the episode Best of Both Worlds, and that episode is now, without a doubt, the most important in the history of Star Trek The Next Generation, thanks to this season of Picard because of all the events that happened after it. But it was nice to see her back. I also like that she was promoted to Fleet Admiral. She was very ambitious when we saw her last on the bridge of the Enterprise D all those years ago. So it makes sense that she would reach the highest point in Starfleet because, of her ambition. So I thought that played out really well. Even if I didn't really like a couple of things. I mean, I didn't like that she got killed right away, obviously. She probably didn't like that either. But I also, the fact that it didn't really make sense that she would be all for this, like, very Borg-like thing, which was called Fleet Formation, I think. I mean, I know that, Riker even calls it out, but it really makes no sense at all that she wouldn't, her being an expert on the Borg for decades. I think it was mentioned before. I think she might have been mentioned in First Contact or maybe in the deleted scenes in First Contact that she was now a expert on the Borg. So it makes no sense really that she would be all for this Fleet Formation thing, which is so Borg-like. Outside of that, I still thought it was cool to see the original actress back. And I remember seeing her at a convention a year ago and thinking like, whoa, like I totally forgot about her. It's cool that she's still around. But it's obvious that, that convention, I think, was just months after the filming of this season was completed. So she was probably still sticking around because everybody knew that she would be back. And another note I have as a good point of the episode was I thought it was another good episode for Brent Spiner. I think he's bringing a lot to Data. In the past, he has been quoted as saying that he didn't want to play Data. So maybe this version of Data is different enough for him to play Data, or maybe he just doesn't care about that, or that interview was after he filmed his scenes. But I think he's doing a really good job. He made that comment to LaForge about, I hope we die quickly. That Data that we love that like doesn't really get, jokes. I thought that was really cool. I have a side note that I would love to see more of LaForge and Data. I really like those two characters together. I didn't realize how much I missed them until I see them together in the season. And I know that we're not going to see them for that long because there's only one more episode left. And as of right now, there's no plans for these characters after this. So, I've mentioned before that I'd love to see an anthology series, a story between LaForge and Data. That would be a great concept for one long episode or 3 episodes, more of an event, something like that. Just some kind of adventure for just those two characters and actors. I think it would be really good, and I think that fans would really respond well to it. I know I would. Brent Spiner also had that very meaningful scene with Picard where he just kind of puts his hand on his shoulder. I thought that was really good. Brent Spiner is really knocking it out of the park this season. I think really all of the actors who came back are doing a great job, but Brent Spiner in particular, I think, is really stepping up. Now let's talk about a few things that I didn't care for. First, I'm going to bring up the reveal. I know that if you watch my podcast last week, I said that I was pretty sure that it was going to be the Borg and that I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to be happy about it. Let me say this. I was worried that I thought that it would hit me as hard as the burn from Star Trek Discovery and that I would not like it as much as that. Does not feel like that. I don't feel as shocked in the wrong way with this kind of reveal because for one, I kind of saw it coming, and I'm not the only one. I'm not trying to play myself off as some genius or something like that, but this was kind of coming, especially from the last episode. You could kind of see it coming. A lot of this season is, if you think about it a lot, it doesn't make sense. And a lot of this reveal, if you think about it a lot, it doesn't make sense. Why use the changelings? I think that there were things that they could have used from the Next Generation's past that would have filled in for the changeling. And to me, it almost feels like they spent so much time honoring the legacy of the Next Generation that they kind of didn't care about kind of crapping on the legacy, or at least one part of the legacy of Deep Space Nine. And here, let me be really clear about that, because I know thems are fighting words. They use the changelings in a way that they changed their past. They changed how the morphogenic virus plotline affected Starfleet. They actually made it worse. I mentioned before that the morphogenic virus plotline, when it was introduced on Deep Space Nine originally, was very controversial. And this season of Picard just made it worse, just made Starfleet look worse. And I don't know if it's clear if the experiments that were done on Vadic were done before or after the morphogenic virus was discovered. It seems like it was done after. If it's done after, then you can't just say, well, we already knew about the morphogenic virus, so why is it worse that we saw what was going on? It does seem like this is more nefarious than the morphogenic virus. Vadic herself said that they were trying to create operatives that they could slip into, other cultures and stuff like that, which really does not sound Starfleet. I didn't like that, but I did like that it made Odo that much better. Vadic's backstory is very similar to Odo's. So the fact that she went one way and Odo went a completely different way, it makes Odo a much better character. So in that way, they honor Deep Space Nine. So I hope that makes a little more sense to you. Like, I know that in some ways they have honored Deep Space Nine, but by changing the changelings, and I know that sounds weird, they don't honor the past as much as they are honoring the past of the Next Generation. And, that's too bad. As someone who is a fan of Deep Space Nine, I see that. And again, it takes me out of the story of this story. And I think that there's other ways that they could have got to where they want it to go. And I understand it's very convoluted. Like, even the reveal itself is very convoluted. And I'm going to go into that more in my next segment, which is where I go into questions from the comments. Even the parts that aren't convoluted, it really doesn't make sense when you think about it. And another thing that I didn't really like was, why do you have to use the Borg each season? We've had 3 seasons of Picard, and we've had 3 Borg queens. That's pretty substantial, considering that there's supposed to be only one Borg queen. The Borg are kind of like the Highlander of the alien species in Star Trek Picard. There's only supposed to be one queen, but we've seen 3. And you could say that, of course, Annie Wershing was an actress who played the Borg queen in the 2nd season, and she has passed away since. But unless I'm mistaken, I believe that these scenes were filmed right after the scenes from season 2, and in some ways they were filmed concurrently at the same time. So I don't think that was the intention. I think the intention was always to bring Alice Krieg back for this 3rd season. And then We had Alison Pill play the Girardi Borg or Queen or whatever you want to call her in the second season. So we've had 3 queens in 3 seasons, and we've had the Borg appear and be really not just appear, but be a main part of the plot line in each of the seasons of Picard. So I don't understand why they have to keep going to the well with the same enemy. It is cool that the Borg are part of the final enemy that they're facing. I do like that. I mean, I think I'd feel cheated if it was the Changelings, because the Changelings are not a Next Generation villain. So to have the crew come back and to face the villains of really another series would feel kind of like silly, and I wouldn't like that. So I do like the Borg kind of as part of this season, but then why did they have to be in the second season and in the first season? And again, I'm going to go into those questions a little bit later in the podcast as well. At the end of the day, it just seems like the writers and the creators of this series don't care a lot about changing the past. And to me, it does make a difference. And when it comes to the reveal, they change so much about so many things that we know and has been established. It doesn't really seem authentic to me. So I wasn't a big fan of the reveal. I also was not a big fan of the fact that they killed off Captain Shaw. To me, I think he's my favorite new character that Star Trek has created since Philippa Georgiou. I really feel that strongly because he's so much different than any other officer that we're used to seeing on a Star Trek series. And I like the actor too. I've seen him speak in many interviews, and he's from Chicago. His character's from Chicago. I'm from Chicago, so it's easy to, he's easy to like. And I was really like, why did you have to kill him off? In a way, it seemed like he died just so Seven could be the captain of the Titan. I mean, obviously, he mentions it to her, and then even him saying 7 of 9 at the end, it was so like, of course he was going to say it. It just seemed like tossed in there. And I thought they could have done better with him. Maybe they'll have 7 bring him back with the nanoprobes that she brought back Neelix with. I mean, I know it doesn't make sense that Shaw would have nanoprobes in him because he hates the Borg so much, but hey, like they're fine with changing anything. So who knows? Maybe they will bring Captain Shaw back and we could see Todd Stashwick again. But I didn't like seeing him go. I kind of felt like he was hanging on him by a thread a few times. He's had a couple of big hits this season and bounced back and just couldn't do it the last time. So I was sad to see him go. If that was the point, to create that emotional resonance with that character, I guess, you did it, that worked. But in a way, I really, really wanted to see Captain Shaw go on. And his death really made it seem like he was just there so 7 can now be the captain of the Titan going forward. And then another problem I had with the episode is that I still don't think Jack is a great character. A lot of things about him still don't add up. Early in the season, we saw that he couldn't face Picard in a bar. Like, he couldn't walk up to him and ask him if he was his father. But now he's taking on the Borg Queen by himself. And I understand that there's an aspect that he's like a selfless character, and that has been established throughout this season as well. But it's still a big jump. They take these big jumps left and right with this character, and he's just all over the place. And me not liking the reveal, it does play a part into this because Jack is a big part of that reveal. So if I don't like the reveal, I'm probably not going to like Jack either. I get that. I'm cognizant of that. But still, I think that he's such a big part of this season. He's on the poster, for crying out loud. And I'm just still 9 episodes in. He's still just a character I'm not fond of. I'm not rooting for him. I think that, a lot of things that happen to him are convenient. I mentioned that in the episode before this one, how ridiculous it was that Jack couldn't be found on the Titan, that like Vadic couldn't find Jack using sensors or the transporters or anything like that. And it was just for his character development to be able to do that last scene. It just, for me, it's not enough. I need like things that make sense sort of with this character. And there's a lot about this character that still doesn't make sense in regard to his motivations. That's just me. I could be wrong, but these are the things I didn't like about the episode. My overall feeling of this episode is probably going to be best stated in the end of this podcast, where I kind of talk about nostalgia and how it affects, the Star Trek fandom. But I'll say that I don't like the episode as much as other people have. I know that some people are calling it the greatest episode of Star Trek ever. I understand why they would say that, but I just don't feel that way. I do like the nostalgia hits. I like the member berries, but the plot line itself is just not doing a ton for me. But again, that's just my opinion, and I could be wrong. So let me know in the comments, how did you feel about this episode? Do you feel like a lot of people do, that it's the greatest episode of Star Trek ever? Or do you just feel like it's a good episode of Star Trek? I would put it in that context. I think it's a good episode of Star Trek. I don't think it's the best, and I definitely don't think it's the worst. But let me know your feelings in the comments below. So now I wanted to go over a few comments that I had in my breakdown of the episode Vox and questions that fans had. The question here is from Mike Motaika. Hopefully I got that right, Mike. And he states, I have a question. Since season 2 ended with a Borg queen joining the Federation, why wasn't she the first person they called to find out? WTF. And a lot of people asked, what role do the Borg that we saw have in this season? Because it seems like they don't have any at all, like they just disappeared. And that's honestly what it seemed like to me. And that's one of my problems with this series, is that they seem to sometimes just forget things that they established in this season, in this series, or in prior series. And to me, it did kind of feel like they forgot about the Borg that they established last season. And it felt like that to a lot of fans too. So much so that Terry Matalas, the showrunner of Picard, had to come out and answer this on Twitter. So this is what he states about Jurati's faction of the Borg. That was an alternate faction of the Borg from an alt timeline. History was not rewritten. The real Borg were still in the Delta Quadrant after poisoned by Janeway. Agnes Niceborg are distracted, guarding a transwarp conduit across the galaxy. Shaw explains this in 304. So I'm going to break this answer down. First, when he's talking about the real Borg were still in the Delta Quadrant after poisoned by Janeway, he is referencing the finale of the series Star Trek Voyager. And in that finale, a future version of Janeway from an alternate timeline, I guess, poisons the Borg with a computer virus. It's more complicated than that, but just for the purposes of this podcast and not giving 20 minutes to that episode, we'll just talk about that like that. So because of that, it just breaks the Borg down. Like in that episode, you see just things collapsing on themselves. And because of that virus, the Borg in the Delta Quadrant and anybody connected to the Borg in the Delta Quadrant were poisoned by Janeway. And they kind of touched on that in this first season of Picard as well. That's why the Romulans had access to that Borg cube. Terry Matalas next says, Agnes Niceborg are distracted guarding a transwarp conduit across the galaxy. This is directly referencing the events of the second season of Picard. That transwarp conduit must be the thing that they had to stop. I don't remember that being established as a transwarp conduit. Maybe I missed that, but it looks like that's what they're doing right there. They just, I guess, temporarily put a Band-Aid over that, and that's not stopped for good. So they're there guarding that, and that's why I guess they can't intervene in this event. And when he says Shaw explains this in 304, in the 4th episode of the season, when Shaw talks about his experience with the Borg and Locutus in the 10 Forward scene, he mentions that there are 2 versions of the Borg, and that the hippie Borg is what he calls the Agnes Borg, are not the only Borg, that the real Borg are still out there, quote unquote. So that kind of is their reasoning behind why the Borg that were established in the second season weren't a part of this season and won't be a part of this season. I think Alison Pill is already working on a different series, so I don't know if they could get her back if they wanted to, but that is the reason why they are not a part of this season. I hope that answers your questions for that. If you still have questions about that, let me know in the comments and I'll just directly answer you, or I'm sure somebody else will help out. The next question is a question I had after watching the episode 2, so kudos to Glenn Campbell for pointing this out. He says, so with the Excelsior destroyed in episode 9, it would safe to assume Eleanor has been killed. Yay. That is exactly what I thought too when they were talking about the Excelsior. I was like, oh no, that's where Eleanor is. But a lot of people had that question, and Terry Matalas also took to Twitter and just basically said Eleanor was not on the Excelsior. So again, a convenient truth that's used for a Terry Matalas series, and that's our answer. But if you're wondering why we would think that, in the second season of Picard, it was shown that Eleanor, who was like the warrior elf from the first season of Picard, had joined Starfleet and was serving under Raffi on the Excelsior. In the beginning of this season of Picard, Raffi is no longer on the Excelsior, so it's kind of ambiguous to what happened to Eleanor. Eleanor being such a big part of her arc in the second season, and we never heard of Eleanor in this season, and it looks like all we know is that he was not on the Excelsior. Hopefully, he was not on any ship at all. Elnor was young. We saw him as a young boy with Picard in the first season when they had the flashbacks. So if he was on a Starfleet vessel, he would have been assimilated by the Borg. So him not being on the Excelsior, hopefully he wasn't on any Starfleet vessel at the time. I know people have asked about Riker and Troy's daughter because she's supposed to be, I guess, in Starfleet Academy. It's unknown if Starfleet Academy was affected by this or not. It would make sense for them to do that. But that kind of brings up the point. If they were trying to assimilate people in Starfleet under the age of 25, why was their first target a Starfleet recruitment center? Why did they choose a target that housed, all these people that could have been assimilated by them? It makes kind of no sense that they would have gone after a recruitment center since they were literally assimilating the youth of Starfleet. But I guess that's a story for another tale, or maybe another plot line that's never going to get resolved. I don't know. But to answer that question, yes, Elnor is still alive. He was not on the Excelsior, and hopefully he was nowhere near Starfleet during this time. So the question here is, I still don't really understand how and why the Borg code got into the transporters. Seems like a weak, unlikely, and nonsensical plot to me. Think a quirk of Picard's biology would somehow become known by the transporter system as a common aspect of all humans. So a lot of people have asked some form of this question, like how do the changelings basically fit into this plot line with the Borg? So this is the easiest way that I think I can explain how the code assimilated most of Starfleet. Because Jack is Picard's offspring, he can act as a transmitter for the Borg collective signal. Picard was assimilated in a specific way, that's why he was called Locutus, using organic technology. They don't explain what organic technology is, it's just a MacGuffin. So you just have to go with the flow here. This organic technology made him a receiver for the Borg signal, Picard that is. That's why Picard can still hear the voices of the Borg during the events of the film First Contact. Then in this season, the changelings stole Picard's dead body from Daystrom Station and extracted this organic technology, which gave them a DNA code. So basically, something with him transmitting his DNA code, organic technology, whatever, down to Jack, the serial number or the DNA code or whatever you want to call it is in Picard's brain because that's where the organic technology is. So the changelings, when they took that out of Picard's brain, they got that code, whatever that code was that connects to the code that is in Jack, that makes Jack the transmitter and Picard the receiver. That's what that code is. And if you're wondering why Picard now isn't being controlled by Jack, Picard isn't that guy anymore. That's the dead body. Picard is a robot. So if Picard was still alive in that body, I think that Jack could control him too. But again, he's dead. So he's not using that body anymore. That's why Picard can't be controlled by Jack. So the changelings got that code. Then they took over a bunch of Starfleet officers and implemented that code into the transporter code of each ship that they had operatives on as like a standard code. So Data tells the audience in this episode that in order to make transporters work faster, they kind of store cache, like computers do it too. Every time you load a web page, sometimes like things are saved in your computer's memory, so it loads things faster. So kind of the transporter kind of works like that. They have certain pieces of code that say this is always a part of humans, this is always a part of Vulcans. So if this is a Vulcan, put this as part of their DNA code when they rematerialize. What the changelings did was they took over all these transporter chiefs or whatever. And if you remember, the first changeling that we saw on the Titan, he was in the transporter room. I don't know if he worked in that area, but we did see him in the transporter room. So it looks like that was their first act, was for the changelings to take over transporter chiefs. And then once they were able to steal Picard's body from Daystrom and get that code, they told all their operatives what the code was, and they put it in the transporter code as standard. So every person that used a transporter code from this vessel, when they used it, when they rematerialized, they would basically be assimilated. They would have this DNA code in their system that was just dormant, waiting to be activated. And then when Jack was assimilated fully by the Borg Queen in this episode, that's when she was able to start that like huge, like mortal engine thing. So she could fully assimilate everyone that had that code. And the reason that people only under the age of 25 are assimilated, because Dr. Crusher said that after 25, your brain doesn't keep developing. And because of that, you wouldn't have gotten this code in your brain or something. It's just something, again, to make the plot convenient. So that means that not everybody on the ship is assimilated, because if they didn't have that under 25 thing in there, then everybody would be assimilated and it would be over. Another convenient truth right there. So I hope that answers your questions about how this plot line all works. I know it is kind of convoluted, but let me know in the comments if you think I got anything wrong, or if you still have any questions about anything from the 9th episode of Picard after watching it and hearing me talk about it. Next, I thought we would have some fun and do some finale predictions. I would love to hear any predictions you have about the finale of Picard, and I guess for the Next Generation crew. My first prediction for the finale is kind of an easy one, which is that Jack has a plan. And the reason I say this is because I saw a lot of people online question Jack's motivations towards the end of the 9th episode. Like, why did he just go find the Borg Queen? Was he already assimilated at that point? Was she using a signal to bring him back? She was doing something, Jack could hear her voice and that whole door and all that kind of stuff. But I think that Jack actually has a plan, and that he went after the Queen because he thinks that he's going to be able to beat the Borg Queen. I don't know why he thinks that he alone has the power to defeat the Borg Queen. I mean, he just got these powers himself. He just understands them. So I don't know why he thinks he can do it, but he does have a line in the 9th episode where I think it's Picard that asks him, what is this? What is he doing? And he responds with futility, which is obviously referencing the infamous Borg quote, "Resistance is futile." So if he's saying what he's doing is futility, then he is forming some kind of resistance. So he, at least in his mind, he is going to attack the Borg Queen head on and somehow take her out. I don't know how he believes that he'll be able to do it, but I do not think that he was just assimilated. I don't think that he was just going to her because he was compelled to. I think that he has a plan that he thinks will work. I don't know that it will, but I think that that's the point there, that we're going to see pretty much in the first act of the finale, him kind of enact whatever his plan is, and we'll see Jack go head to head with the Borg Queen. And my next prediction is that we will see a new type of Borg Queen played by Alice Krieg. Obviously, there's a reason why we didn't see her face in the 9th episode. We just kind of saw her from behind, and it's kind of ambiguous as to the fact of if she is the face that Vadic was communicating with. That voice was kind of a masculine voice, I thought. So maybe her voice was being changed purposely so we didn't see the Borg Queen reveal coming. But I don't know. I don't know if there's like another character that we haven't seen yet. I wouldn't be surprised if there is like a new thing that we have not seen yet that kind of ties to the face that Vadic was speaking with. Because if that was supposed to be the Borg Queen, okay. But I really think if that was the case, then we would have seen her face in the scene that we saw them together in the 9th episode. So I don't know what's going on with Alice Krieg as the Borg Queen, but I think that we are going to see a new type of Borg Queen in the finale, and that's why they brought Alice Krieg back. I hope they do mention, Vadic and who Vadic was communicating with, and if that was the Borg Queen, because I don't think that was evident to me. But let me know in the comments if you maybe saw something online that contradicts that. But I'm still not sure that the Borg Queen was the face that Vadic was communicating with. So hopefully we get some resolution to that, and we see some type of new Borg Queen in the finale. The next thing that I think will happen, and I really hope this happens, and I'm going to be really disappointed if it doesn't, is that I think we are going to see the Enterprise D face off against the Enterprise F. There was just too many comments made at the end of that episode about the weapon systems on the D. Worf made at least one, if not two, and then LaForge plainly stated that they would be loading torpedoes into the Enterprise D, and that, Worf would have, weapons for the Enterprise D. So I think that that's all too much on the nose. I think that we are going to see the Enterprise D face off against the Enterprise F, and the Enterprise D win in some kind of tricky way that, the old ship always does. We've seen that many times before. We saw the Reliant versus the Enterprise, and then the Excelsior sort of versus the Enterprise when Scotty, sabotaged that one. So I think that we're going to see something like that. I think we're going to see the Enterprise D face off against the Enterprise F. That's probably why we didn't get the Enterprise E in the season, and we got the Enterprise F, because if you had the D versus the E, you just have like Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage. You got two baby faces going against each other, and it doesn't work that way. If anybody knows pro wrestling, it doesn't work. Nobody wants to see two heels or two baby faces going against each other. And I think that that's what would happen if we had the Enterprise D versus the E. So that's why they eliminated the E from the series, and we're going to get the F versus the D, because less people, of course, will be cheering for nobody's going to be cheering for the F. Everybody's going to be cheering for the Enterprise D. So I think that we will see the Enterprise D versus the Enterprise F in the finale. And then my final prediction for the finale, and I kind of threw this one out there in my breakdown as well, I think that we will see Wil Wheaton return as Wesley. That is harder to say than you would think. That took me 3 tries for some reason. But I think we will see him return. I'm not going to say his name again or the character. But I think that, he returned last season, and we know that Wil Wheaton is available. I mean, pretty much anything that Star Trek has going, Wil Wheaton shows up. I mean, I think if Star Trek had toys come out and Happy Meals, Wil Wheaton would show up at McDonald's and serve you the Happy Meal. He's just everywhere that Star Trek is, And speaking of things that he's in charge of for Star Trek, he does the Ready Room, which is like an after show series for basically any Star Trek series. And they did not have an episode for this week. They wanted to keep spoilers from the next episode, so they don't want to have an episode about episode 9, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I tend to think that perhaps Wesley returned originally in the 9th episode, and they spoke about that, or something happened in the 9th episode that they changed, that they spoke about in the Ready Room, because I think that's the only reason that would be pushed back or not shown. So I really would not be surprised if we see Wesley return. I mean, we're talking about his half-brother, right? Jack Crusher is his half-brother. He's the main part of the season. His mom has been a big part of the season. He's now got like a cool, like half-stepdad, in Picard that he's had his own adventures with and own, story with. So I think really if Wil Wheaton doesn't return, I think it would be a waste. I don't know why they wouldn't bring him back. And I think that it would be a loss if they didn't. So those are my 4 predictions: that Jack has a plan, that he's not just assimilated, that he does think that he can take on the Borg Queen. My second prediction is that we will see a new type of Borg Queen played by Alice Krige, and that's why we did not see her in the 9th episode. I think that for sure we will see the Enterprise D versus the Enterprise F, and that's why the Enterprise E is not in this season, and the Enterprise F is substituting for that ship. And then finally, I think that Wil Wheaton will return as Wesley. That only took me 2 times that time. But I think that those are my predictions for the finale. But I would love to hear your predictions for the finale, so let me know those down in the comments below. Then next I want to talk about this really cool story about this season of Picard in regards to how it's doing with its viewing numbers. We haven't got a lot of stats from Picard, which usually means that there aren't a lot of good stats. I mean, when a studio has a series that's doing well, they promote the crap out of it. They will tell you, this is the #1 series on this and the #1 series on that. Like you'll hear that over and over again, and it will be in every promo for that series going forward for like the next 6 months. And we don't hear a lot of that about Star Trek. We usually just see like fan reviews and stuff like that. But this week we got some really good news. And that news is that Star Trek Picard is the first Star Trek series to break into the top 10 of the Nielsen ratings. If you don't know what the Nielsen ratings are, I think they used to be a lot more important than they are now, but they are still very important. But what they kind of are is a business standard for how popular a series is. And the rating system has changed a lot in the past few years with streaming becoming that much more prominent. But still, the Nielsen ratings are kind of a standard for if your series is doing well. And for the week of 3/13, so March 13th through March 19th, Star Trek Picard was the #9 series on the Nielsen rating. So what that means is that was week 5 of Star Trek Picard. So the Ro Laren episode was what was released that week. But this rating system doesn't just take into account the views of the latest episode. It takes into account all the episodes available on that platform. So this means that the Ro Laren episode was not just a popular episode, but it also means that people were catching up with Picard during that week. So what that is really indicative of is that people were catching on to Picard during that week. People were hearing through word of mouth that this was a series that I should watch. And they were not only watching episode 5, but episodes 1 through 4, and maybe even episodes in seasons 1 and 2. So that's why this stat is so important. But besides that stat, another thing that Star Trek Picard did this last week, they finally cracked the top 10 of all TV shows online by engagement. In this current environment of streaming shows, in my opinion, this is the most important stat. This stat is indicative of the date 4/13/23, which means this is right after the 9th episode of the series. So this is the day that Vox was released, which means that this episode was as popular as, The Mandalorian and Succession. Maybe not as high on this list, but it was in the same neighborhood. And just to be on the same list, I mean, think about all the millions of shows, or let's just say the thousands of popular shows that are online right now that people could watch. It is super hard to crack this top 10. And you can see by the other shows on this list how hard it is, because these are shows that everybody's talking about every day. And for Picard to enter this list at all is a huge accomplishment. So having said that, like, how important are these stats compared to what happens on, Twitter and the petition that's going around? There is a petition to make a Star Trek Legacy series based on characters from this season of Picard. I'm not sure how many people have signed it as of this point. I know the last time I checked, it was like 15,000 people, something like that. So it probably has a lot more now. But I know that a lot of people talk about Star Trek Picard on Twitter. It does trend a lot. So people are kind of wondering, what's more important? Is stuff like that more important? Or is the stats stuff more important? The analytics stuff more important? I will say that without a doubt, the analytics stuff is more important, because for one, it's a lot easier to manipulate people's engagement on Twitter, and also, this petition that's going around. Now, I know that I just said that the most important stat that Picard just got was the top 10 of engagement. And of course, Twitter is part of that engagement, but it's not all of it. It's like a slice of the pie. It's not the whole pie. And we've seen with things like the Zack Snyder universe that you can use bots and stuff to kind of manipulate how popular something is online just by using technology. So that's why I would say that the Twitter stuff and the petition that's going around, I don't think it's anywhere near as important as being, one of the most talked about and most engaged series of any series online. I think that these lists that I mentioned before are the ones that Picard wants to aim for, and it's great that we are seeing them on those lists. So then the next question becomes, how much does this help the show Star Trek Legacy? How does it help that series get made? So I want to point this out first. I saw last week that the series Star Trek Starfleet Academy, which for some reason I always call Star Trek Academy, Star Trek Starfleet Academy hired Picard writer Kylie Rosetter. And she's a very young writer, but it looks like she's the kind of writer that has kind of like come along with Alex Kurtzman and Star Trek for the last few years. She's credited on all 3 seasons of Picard, and she's also responsible for co-writing the episode Vox, which just aired. So the fact that she is moving to Starfleet Academy, it kind of makes it seem like Paramount and Star Trek are putting all their eggs in that basket. I mentioned when I talked about that series that they also hired Tawny Newsome as a writer. Tawny Newsome plays the character Beckett Mariner on Lower Decks, and she's hilarious. She's really funny, and she really gets Star Trek. And it's awesome that she's going to continue on in Starfleet Academy, and that show is better for it for having her on it. But the fact that Paramount is kind of funneling everything towards that series kind of makes it seem like they're not interested in anything else. I don't think that these stats, as good as they are, I don't think they help Star Trek Legacy get made. What it helps is the bottom line for Paramount, because it gets people to watch not just Picard, but it's going to get people to watch The Next Generation, and it's going to get people to watch the movies that this cast were in. And remember, they're 4 movies, so it's not like it's just one movie that they're going back and watching. This is a lot of content that people are now going to watch more because of the series Star Trek Picard, because it leans so hard on nostalgia. And I'll raise my hand and say, like, they got me. I know that I rewatched First Contact, and I rewatched a bunch of Deep Space Nine during Picard just because of stuff that was going on and things that I remembered and stuff like that. So they got me, and I'm sure they got a lot of other people too that are watching this video right now. And I think that was the goal. I don't know that there was ever a plan for these characters to move forward. And I think that you can tell that by the writing and the way that this plotline is moved, that it's really leaning on the legacy characters. That's a really bad pun. Me saying, with me saying on one hand, we're not going to get a Star Trek Legacy show, but it's because of these legacy characters that we won't get a Star Trek Legacy show, because this show, Star Trek Picard, is all about nostalgia. It's all about people that love The Next Generation and want to see these characters come back. And from a business standpoint, not from a fan standpoint, from a business standpoint, from the people that make these shows, what they look at is, where are we going to make money? Where are we going to gain fans? And where are we going to be able to sell merchandise? And in regards to Star Trek Picard, I think the emphasis is on the stuff that has already been before it. I think that the point of Picard is to reinvigorate the fan base to watch older stuff, but I don't think it is to move forward with these characters at all. And this really brings me to my final point of my podcast this week. And it's a question that I want you to ask yourself, really, when you think about the future of Star Trek. And the question is nostalgia enough to sustain Star Trek? And this is what I mean. Think about it in this context. If you were someone who is not a huge fan of The Next Generation, if you were just like a passing fan that like saw the big episodes like Best of Both Worlds and maybe saw the movies, years ago, or just saw them once or something like that, would you be able to enjoy this final season of Picard? Because I think any fan or any conscientious objector would see that this season is just based on nostalgia. I mentioned pro wrestling earlier. This season is really a lot like pro wrestling. When you watch pro wrestling, there are two different kinds of people that like pro wrestling. There are the ones that like the in-ring work. And then there are people that are just there for the big bops, the power moves, and the TNA. The big hits, the flashy lights, the real big moments, and the things that remind them of stuff that happened before. There are a lot of wrestlers that are part of a lineage, like the Rhodes and the Flairs and the stuff like that. So you have a lot of that too. You have a lot of nostalgia in wrestling. And I kind of feel like Picard is a lot like pro wrestling, where if you think about it too much, it really doesn't make any sense. But just seeing these characters and seeing them on the Enterprise and seeing them on the bridge and stuff like that, and seeing them do the Picard maneuver again and Worf beating people up. And, a lot of people just want to see that, all of that, they just want to see the big pops, the power moves, and, the big moments and the things that make them feel like they did when they first watched The Next Generation. And I want to be perfectly clear. I have no problem with that. For me, it's like when I go back to my hometown, I hate the things that are changed. I want everything to stay the same from when I was 10 years old, even though it makes no sense and probably makes the community a lot worse. I feel bad when I see the new buildings and, the Chick-fil-A and stuff like that, because I still want to see the old pizza place and the video store, even though it makes no sense to sell a video store. But in a way, I think that's the way people feel towards Picard. I think you have fans that just love The Next Generation and just want to see these characters again and see the bridge of the Enterprise again. And that's fine. I get it. But I also feel like I think we can do better with Star Trek. I think that you can hit both notes, that you can appeal to the fandom, and that you can also create new stories that make a lot of sense. My best kind of example for this is The Mandalorian. And I understand that Star Wars is a huge fandom and that there are different feelings about The Mandalorian. But I'm only going to talk about my feeling about The Mandalorian, and how I feel about that show is that my favorite thing about it is that it is not a Skywalker saga story, meaning that it is not part of the Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker, Rey Skywalker main plot line of Star Wars. It does interweave with it, and it does include some characters that were involved in said storyline, but for the most part, we are looking at a different corner of the Star Wars universe, that being the Mandalorian culture. And because of that, The Mandalorian as a series doesn't have to rewrite Star Wars as much as really even Star Wars has. I mean, if you look at those last three movies, I think the worst part about those three movies were the parts of Star Wars lore that they just forgot about or just, rewrote. I think even Mark Hamill had a problem with the way that Luke Skywalker was portrayed in that movie that he was in. So I think that there is something to be said for the way that The Mandalorian uses the world that Star Wars built, and it feels so authentic and so familiar, but there's still all this new stuff we're learning now about the Mandalorians that I didn't know. I wasn't a huge fan of the animated series, so I don't even know that part of the story, so a lot of this is new to me. So I mean, I really like that. But if I look at the third season of Picard, and if I just brought somebody in that didn't know anything about Star Trek, I don't think they would enjoy the third season of Picard. If I brought somebody in that didn't know anything about Star Wars, I think they could still enjoy The Mandalorian. I think there's enough new stuff there that, you can really build how you feel about the franchise from what you see in that series. And I'm sure there's a whole swath of fans that are just Mandalorian fans and like The Mandalorian more than Star Wars. I don't think you're going to find a lot of people that like Picard more than The Next Generation. And I think that's my point, that you can make something that appeals to both groups, the new fans and the old fans. Is it going to be 100% for both? No way. Nobody's ever been able to crack that case. I mean, even when you look at a series like Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, with Better Call Saul, of course, being a prequel to Breaking Bad, both those series are very well renowned and they're very different. I mean, in tone. And Better Call Saul, even though it's a prequel, it came after, doesn't really talk about Breaking Bad a ton. In the later seasons, it definitely becomes more prominent, but you really get a lot about these characters that were in Breaking Bad that you didn't know on this series, Better Call Saul. And I think that that's what Star Trek can do, but it doesn't seem like they're interested in it. It seems like they really just want to lean into the nostalgia. I saw one review for Vox, the last episode, that said Terry Matalas didn't just push the nostalgia button, he fell asleep on it. And I agree. I think that sometimes there's just so much nostalgia that it's just too obvious. The member berries are too often and too plentiful. And there just needs to be more there. There needs to be a story there that's new and fresh. And, I made so many points about how they brought the Borg back 3 times. We've had 3 different queens. They changed the changelings. I mean, there's so much that they really retread on. I don't understand why. I think that you can make a plot, you can make a narrative that will appeal to old fans and will appeal to new fans. Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about a series like Star Trek Legacy, the bottom line is, will this attract new fans, or are we only going to play the hits? I think that's what Paramount has to decide on. Are these series going to attract new fans, or are we just going to bring back, the fans that haven't watched First Contact in a few years? If you look at Star Trek Starfleet Academy, if you look at Prodigy, if you look at Lower Decks, these are series that are treading new ground. I mean, Lower Decks and Prodigy do have characters and do have scenes that, have shown up on other series, but the fan base that they're going after, for the most part, I believe are new. When it comes to Star Trek Starfleet Academy, they're definitely going for a younger age group and new fans. Like, that is what that series is going to be about. They're going to try and get new fans into Star Trek and get them into this vast library. With a show like Star Trek Legacy, I think it treads the line. I think you've got these new characters that were introduced that maybe fans will watch because they like Seven and, whoever else you're able to get back. But for the most part, I don't think Seven, as good as a character they've made her, I don't think she can carry a series. I don't think that if they don't have Geordi, or they don't have Data, or they don't have Riker, I think that you just have Seven and you have a cast of new characters. I don't know how that series works, especially if you're not going to bring back Shaw now. I don't know how Legacy works, because you're not going to attract new fans and you're not playing up to the nostalgia of old fans. So you just got nothing. So in my opinion, that's why there are no plans to make Legacy. But I could be wrong. So let me know. I would really love to know your feelings on this. Is nostalgia enough to sustain Star Trek? Do you think that they can keep doing this? I mean, if they did an anthology series, I think that would be another play off the nostalgia of the fans. And I think that would be a better way than to do a 10-episode series. I think if you do smaller chunks, I think that's a little more interesting. And I think you don't run into these problems of pacing and, again, these stories that don't make a lot of sense. I think you eliminate that a little bit. So if you are going to bring characters back, just make it for 1 or 2 episodes. Don't make them the focus. And if you have an anthology series, even better. But let me know in the comments, how do you feel about the nostalgia of Star Trek as far as how it is affected by not only the fan base, but how the producers at Paramount will create new series, new content, new films, whatever. How do you think nostalgia plays a part into that? Well, thank you very much for joining me. That's all I have this time. The best way to support the work that I do would be to hit that subscribe button right now if you have not yet, and to definitely hit that like button. It costs you nothing, but it does a lot for my channel. Thank you very much again for joining me, and I will see you next time on What Did I Miss?